We're just capturing magic right now. This is absolutely insane! Take her up. Unless you've been living under a rock, flying drones is something everyone is capable of doing, and it's a great way to capture stunning imagery. In this episode of Reframed, we take a look at how professional cinematographers and photographers can benefit from sending their full-size cameras high into the sky like never before. Let's do it. Aerial cinematography captured by drones has been a staple for film, TV, and commercial productions for the last decade or so, as more consumer-grade aircraft have been released. This past year, Sony announced and launched their Airpeak S1, which finally gives full control to Sony camera operators to fly their alpha cameras, including the FX3, and a whole array of lenses varying from ultra-wides like the 14mm 1.8, all the way up to the 85mm 1.8. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to leverage the power of the Airpeak with the Sony Alpha 1 so you too can create ultra-cinematic shots virtually anywhere you're allowed to fly. One of the biggest things to know about flying in general is to make sure that you're qualified and licensed first before you commercialize any of your content. You'll need a Part 107, which allows you to sell the content that you create to commercial clients, and it's also helpful in understanding the plethora of flight regulations and airspaces that are spread out over the country. To be clear though, you don't need to have a 107 to fly, as you can do it recreationally, but you could be held liable if you sell the content without a license. To maximize the performance of the Airpeak, the first thing you want to do is make sure your camera and gimbal are perfectly balanced. It's something that, for a lot of users, they may not be used to, and it's incredibly important if you want to have the smoothest footage possible. By making a few simple adjustments to your flight package, you should easily be able to balance your gimbal in just a matter of a few minutes. Once you get the process done, it makes it so much easier to repeat it in the future. You'll know your camera is perfectly balanced when you can hold and move the gimbal into any position. As you can see here, I can move the camera in any position. I can tilt it to the side, I can tilt it up, I can tilt it down, and the camera remains in the same position. This lets me know that the camera is perfectly balanced. The reason you want the gimbal to be perfectly balanced is because it reduces stress on the gimbal motors, which means less power is being used, which allows for extended flight times. Now we'll set up the camera. Before we launch, we want to make sure our camera is set up to film at its peak. One thing you may not be aware of is how the internal stabilizer is affected by the gimbal. Because of this, it's best to turn off the internal IBIS on your camera and let the gimbal do the work. For majority of users, the best video settings to use is 4K 60p. The additional FPS will help aid in extra stabilization that may be required after the flight, and you can always reconform 60p down to a more cinematic 24p after the fact. If you're using the Sony Alpha 1 in 8K mode, I recommend using 30p because it helps reduce any chance of having to restabilize the footage in post if necessary. From our flight control, we can manage all the aspects of our camera, from the shooting mode to white balance to focus and of course shutter speed and aperture. Once we're happy with all of our settings, it's time to take off. Once you're in the air, there are multiple ways to create cinematic compositions. The first being a low-level, high-speed shot. The closer the aircraft is to the floor or the ground, the more perspective movement and change we'll be able to see in our frame. We can then rise as it's traveling forward to go from a sweeping fast shot to a landscape reveal, which creates a two-part shot. One of the biggest tips I can offer is making sure you're using smooth, concise movements and that you don't jerk the camera around while you're filming. Use very small, subtle movements if you wish to change your trajectory mid-shot. This will be less jarring for viewers and make the frame much more professional looking. If you're looking for a new perspective when it comes to filming cinematic shots, think about a 90-degree tilt down that looks firmly down at the ground below. This type of composition allows viewers to see a perspective that's not often seen, and depending on what the subject is, can look very abstract and alluring. This type of shot can be great for bridging gaps in storytelling when you want to transport the viewer from one location to another. I personally love this type of perspective because it makes you think about where you are and what you're seeing. Foreground objects are also incredibly important to have in your aerial shots as well, because the perspective motion that's created when flying gives the viewer a sense of depth and range. Because the drone is moving at high speeds, when you push through objects or scenes, you create more motion and more visual interest in your shots. That's why sometimes the best aerial shots aren't the ones taken at 400 feet, but rather the ones that are 20 to 50 feet off the ground. Here are some examples of just that type of movement. The last type of cinematic movement we'll talk about is the epic orbital reveal. If you have a subject or subjects you want to position the craft in front of or behind, depending on which direction you want to reveal. As the drone orbits around the subject, you can simply do a 20 to 40 foot rise while tracking the subject to then reveal what the subject is witnessing. This is best done when you have the ability to have a dual operator, but it's still definitely possible to do by yourself as well. There are many incredible and wondrous advantages to using a drone. Just make sure you're always aware of your surroundings and to properly ensure you're in a safe designated area to fly. Thanks for joining me on this Reframed. I'll see you out there.